Amen. Good morning, y'all. My name is Will. I'm one of the pastors here. I appreciate what Tiana said about the coffee. Monday through Friday, Dawson Kitts, our youth director, works 30 hours for our church, and then he also works part-time for our childcare center. But before he was working part-time for the childcare center, he worked at a coffee shop in Hardin Valley, and so he's a pro's pro. And you can always tell, like, when Dawson made the coffee. If you come around the corner, you get one, you're like, Dawson's. And then otherwise, I'm the same kind of thing. Like when it says 2 to 3 scoops, I'm like, well, that looks like one, and put it in, and then scrape it off the bottom and do that good stuff. But it always you can always tell when something good has been there, and that's a good segue for where we want to start this morning, which is when you ask Americans what they would like to eat for their last meal, the results come back sounding pretty American. There's a new study from Choice Mutual. I appreciate that a life insurance company is asking these kinds of questions. Uh, this new study from 2026 from Choice Mutual shows that the top requests for a last meal are probably what you would expect. Among Americans, steak and potatoes were 1 and 2, pizza and pasta were 3 and 4. The Mountain Dew lover in me appreciated that soft drinks were the number one beverage of choice for your last meal. It's very American. Glass of wine was number 2. I also love that water was third. It's your last meal. But huge percentage of Americans are like, I'll just have water. It's okay. Like, I don't get that. I appreciate in this study when they asked general questions about what kind of meal a person would want. You can see how the everyday stuff comes through. The number one response is if it's my last meal, I want my favorite thing, followed closely by something that gives me comfort. And then further down is something fancy or something that was maybe available in childhood but isn't available now. Only 1% of the people said for my last meal, I want to try something new. When we think about that kind of conversation, what would I want to eat if it was my last meal? Our minds typically go to the food itself. But if we remove the whole, death and dying component and just think about our most meaningful meals, then the conversation shifts maybe slightly away from the food and more toward the people and the moment. Sometimes the food can even be secondary. One of the most meaningful meals I've ever had in my life was at a Burger King in the Miami airport because we'd been in Haiti for 11 days and I'd been eating the minimum required amount for hospitality of various barnyard animals and a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches because you could survive anywhere in the world with a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. And when we landed back in the States, the first thing we saw past the gate was a Burger King, and it was incredible. And we all felt so very accomplished sitting around there and eating Burger King. Think about if I asked you to tell me about a meaningful meal that you've had. Not just what's your favorite food or what would you pick if you knew it was going to be your last meal, but think about an actual meal that you've had, a meaningful, um, memorable meal that you've had. Would you say? What story would you tell about that? I'm going to give you one of mine recently, and then I'm going to ask you. You don't have to share with the whole group, but I'm going to give you a couple minutes to turn to your neighbor and think about that answer. Um, my daughter was born in June of 2020, so Sophia was born early COVID. It was still very shut down. We lived in Virginia at the time, which had a different set of rules than Tennessee, and so when she was born, I was the only one who could be in the hospital with Alex. It was all kinds of stuff. And then all of our family is in Tennessee. And so the first months and months and months and months of her life it was just the four of us. I bunkered down. We were doing church online and at a minor league baseball stadium. My wife was a cake decorator before COVID. She was a cake decorator one day, and the next day she wasn't when COVID happened and all that stuff. And so we had a very kind of intense bunker kind of life for months and months and months and months. We got immunocompromised people in our family. It was just, it was really great and it was really hard. And after months and months and months of this, Alex's mom, who lives in Nashville, and her sister, who didn't have any kids at that time, invited us to come down and they were going to take our kids for one night. We got in the car and drove 7 hours from Pulaski, Virginia to Nashville, Tennessee. That car ride and the car ride back is what convinced us to buy a minivan. We got in the car and we were like, we're not minivan people. And we were shopping for minivans on the drive home. And we have one now. We got there late at, traveling. Covington would have been 3 at the time, and Sophia would have been, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months. We got there, we dropped our kids with grandparents, we went to this Airbnb and just crashed. And we woke up the next morning, and we went to this breakfast, and I don't remember the name of it. It was still, couldn't eat inside, everybody's still wearing masks, all that stuff. So I got bacon and eggs and an apple thingy. What it was called on the menu, I'm sure, right? Apple thingy. And a cup of coffee. And I asked Alex, do you remember this? And she said, I do. I don't know what I got, but I'm sure it was something fancy. And we walked it back to our Airbnb. And we sat down, and it's the best cup of coffee I've ever had in my life. Not because the coffee was so great, but it was just a moment where we could be slower and we could be together. And it was a moment for the first time in literal months where, at least I thought to myself, things might be okay. We might be okay. And that's one of the most meaningful meals that I have ever had. What about you? Not what will you have for your last meal, but think about an actual meal that you've shared. It could be this morning, or it could be 25 years ago, or whatever the case may be. We're gonna give you just a couple minutes, and you don't have to share after this is over with the whole group, but just turn to your neighbor, turn to somebody you love, turn to somebody you don't know, all that good stuff. Take a couple minutes. What's one of the most meaningful and memorable meals you've ever had? Ready? Go. Should have made sure there was Kleenex in the seats first. Yeah, I told Eric, I was like, don't play Weird Al's Eat It when we're talking about this. This is going to sit a little more emotional. So, in our story, food is a central component in it, not in everyday life. You can't live without it, of course, not just in everyday life, but from the beginning. And in the beginning, all of this goes wrong with food, right? Here's the beginning again, Genesis 3. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together, and they made loincloths for themselves. Adam and Eve, deceived by the serpent, eat from the tree of knowledge. It is, of course, the one thing they were told not to do. They do the very human thing of doing the thing they're told not to do anyway, and this is how sin enters into the story. We always like to point out that the immediate consequence of sin, the immediate consequence of the fall, is awareness, and then shame, and then covering up. The story isn't told in a way that they eat the fruit and then instantaneously become monsters. They don't instantaneously become a sort of Mr. Hyde or anything like that. With the eating of the fruit, the first thing that happens is we become aware of our own nakedness. Then we become ashamed of it. Then we seek to cover it up. Where we were in the story, naked and unashamed, originally created, sin cuts through that in a way that makes us vulnerable. And when you're naked, you're the most vulnerable you'll ever be. And sin cuts through that and wounds in that place, and then shame rushes to fill in that wound. And then we seek to cover it up. This is the way from the first bite to our most recent bite. This is the way that sin works. Tell ourselves that whatever choice we want to make here is the best choice, or it will actually be good for us, or we know better, or any of those things. Or sometimes we just act out of responses and reflexes we've become conditioned to, either by ourselves or by others. We sin as we realize it We're wounded in a specific kind of way that shame immediately rushes into. And then we reflexively move to cover that up, to either pretend like it didn't happen or to let something fester instead of seeking for it to heal. From the beginning, this is what sin does from the first bite. So what does resurrection have to say to that? When Jesus is risen, his first appearance beyond the tomb is later on the same day on Easter. We looked at the first part of this story last week. Jesus is walking on the road to a place called Emmaus. Two of his followers are walking there too, and Jesus comes alongside them, and they don't recognize that it's him, or they're kept from realizing that it's him. And Jesus comes up to them and says, "What's been going on?" And they tell him all the facts of the story. There was a prophet from God, Jesus of Nazareth, mighty in word and deed. We hoped he was the one to do the thing. We hoped he was the capital O one. But he was betrayed and he was crucified, dead and buried. But this morning, some women went to the tomb and came back and said they saw an angel and said it was empty. And some of his disciples, some of our friends, went to the tomb and they found it was empty too, but they didn't see him. And this is the third day since all this has taken place. And Jesus says, in Eugene Peterson's contemporary paraphrase we talked about last week, that Jesus says, "Thick-headed and slow-hearted. Why do you doubt all that the prophets have told you to believe?" And he goes, that this thing that happened just as the prophets, just as the story said it would. And Jesus goes all the way back, not just to prophecy, it says, but he goes all the way back to the books of Moses to show how everything that took place was all leading up to this. And if he's going back to the books of Moses. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If he's not going to obscure prophecies, but if he's going all the way back to the beginning of the story, that means he's going back to the garden, back to the fruit, sin, shame, and the covering up. He's going to go right through all of that. Here's the second half of that story. So they came near the village to which they're going, Jesus still yet unrevealed and his two followers. Jesus walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us. It's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened. They recognized him. He vanished from their sight. They don't recognize him on the road, even in the revealing of Scripture. They don't recognize him on the road. It's here, inside their home. It's here where they invite him in. He takes bread, blesses and breaks it and gives it to them. These are the communion verbs. These are also the feeding of the 5,000 verbs. The language of sharing in death, we might share in life. And when he does, their eyes are opened and they realize it's Jesus. It's a very intentional comparison between these two stories. Think about the language that exists both in Genesis 3 and here in Luke 24. In the first bite of the story, when sin enters through the first bite of the fruit in the garden, we realize the first thing that happens is our eyes are opened. There is a realization, and they realize their own nakedness. We encounter shame. We seek to cover it up. In the first meal of the resurrection, our eyes are simply opened to Jesus. Because the story here, right, the reflex is, I've messed it up, I'm ashamed, I've got to hide this, I've got to leave this. That's a story for all of humanity. It's not just a story for Adam and Eve, that's a story for you and me. That's the way sin works, what sin does, and it's easy for us to believe that that's still our story today. When I sin, when I mess it up, I'm wounded. I've got to hide. I've got to cover up. I've got to let something fester. I'm shamed, and I've got to live, move, breathe, be in that. But now the story is just, and it's so powerful. He did all the explaining on the road in the scriptures, but they don't recognize him there. But here, inside their home, in this personal way with food, their eyes are opened just for a moment to see him, and then he's gone. There's this subtle beauty, and their eyes are open to recognize Jesus, and he doesn't go, yes, it's me, and now let me tell you everything you've done wrong. Or, yes, it's me, and let me offer a lengthy theological diatribe about everything that's just. He did that on the road. It's not that that doesn't matter. He did all of that. What really makes it known, what really makes him known, what really opens their eyes is inside their home. In a much more personal setting, they encounter this Jesus. Their eyes were open and they recognize Jesus, and it's like that is enough. And he's gone and vanished and moves on to the next thing. The story was, and is easy to believe still is, sin and shame and covering up and all of that. But now, the story is Jesus. And that story comes to life in a personal realization, not on the road, but when they taste and see for themselves, to see that in the resurrection, our eyes are opened to a truth greater even than the truth of your sin. Because he is truth. Nothing less will save us. That's exactly what we get. N.T. Wright, in talking about this passage, N.T. Wright, who's on the list of who are the smartest Christians alive, N.T. Wright would be at the top of that list. Here's what N.T. Wright says about this comparison. This, Luke is saying, this is the ultimate redemption. This is the meal which signifies that the long exile of the human race, not just Israel, but the human race, this is the meal which signifies that the long exile of the human race is over at last. This is the start of the new creation. This is the first day, the new week. Because now grace is here and grace abounds. Sin comes in through one fruit. Jesus comes in, the implication being here, Jesus comes in, communion comes in with bread and wine. It's not, it would have been really symbolic and poetic if Jesus went in their house and said, hey, do you have an apple? Or fruit, what, right? Like it would have been a really symbolic, poetic, meaningful thing if Jesus came in and said, do you have any fruit? But that's not what grace does. Grace doesn't say, you sinned like this, so now you get this much grace. That's not what grace does. Grace is much, much, much better, much more. Sin and shame like this, grace stretched as wide as we can. Because the truth is, sin and shame feels like this sometimes. Yeah? Even if you're in this room and you're a believer in Jesus Christ, it's so easy to go back and believe this story. But he's not trading an apple for an apple. He's not doing an eye for an eye. Grace is not the equal of sin. Grace abounds. And when your sin and shame and mine feel like this, your nakedness and mine, because your nakedness is the real you. Not the fake, super awesome, photoshopped version of you, because that version of you doesn't need any grace. Or we tell ourselves, it just needs a little bit. You need more than a little bit of grace. You know how I know? I'm aware of how much grace I need too. The naked version of you, the real version of you, when we're outside of grace, when we're outside of Jesus, it can feel like that sin and shame defines us, cripples us, makes us never good enough, never measures up. And Jesus sees every bit of it. Jesus is not interested in the Photoshop version of you. He didn't come and die for that. That person doesn't exist. He's here for the real you, your real stuff, your real body, your real thoughts, your real doubts, which we'll talk about next week. All of it. All of the things that feel like weigh us down, all the sin, all the shame, all the stuff that just festers. And he just goes right through it. He goes right through it all. Not on the road with fancy explanation, but in their home with something better, because that's what grace does. He takes all of that on because he's the only one who can bear it. And not just that he can, he did. He did. It is finished. Even death right through it. And now in the resurrection, Jesus from the beginning says, I've got an infinitely better story about your life. Because if this is your sin, or you think this is your sin, or whatever, grace abounds. And it's in that moment where they recognize who this is. And now, when God looks at us, if we are in Christ, he doesn't see the sin and the shame and all that other stuff. If you are in Christ, he just sees Jesus. Now, your nakedness toward the real you, now that's not a burden. Now that's a gift. Real you needs grace. That is exactly what it gets. And that grace is going to lead us forward into something better, a better story about your life than we could have ever imagined. This is the good news. This is Jesus. This is grace. It is everything, and it is for all of this whole story. All of this is always headed towards a banquet and a feast where Dawson makes the coffee. That's the imagery, a place where we're going, a place where we can raise a glass once more with the people we've loved and lost. And all the things we carried in this life that are so heavy, the stuff we tried to cover up, the stuff other people did to us that we tried to cover up, and all that can just fall away. And we can see and not just believe deep in our bones. Everything's going to be okay. And in the resurrection, Jesus starts. It is the way they recognize him. And when we believe in Jesus, when we live by grace, we might start to believe that everything here is okay. Your sin and shame and all the ways we seek to cover that up are some of the most human things about us. We need grace. And in the resurrection, in the first meal on the first day of the week, first day of a new week, Jesus makes himself so that what defines our lives is no longer our sin and shame. Now what defines our lives is the grace of God through Jesus Christ. That, my friends, is the good news.